Kings, 1 Kings chapter 7 this morning. What would it be like to go through an entire year without purchasing anything new? That's a question a West Coast group of environmental activists asked themselves in 2006. In January of 2006, these 10 friends declared a sabbatical from American consumerism. The compact, as they called it, was a mutual pledge. They agreed not to buy anything other than food, essential toiletries, underwear, and items for health and safety. For a year, these friends virtually purchased nothing. They learned a lot about themselves in the process. After going through this retail withdrawal, Rachel Kessel, 26 years old, says, I found a lot of times there were things I thought I needed that I didn't need that much. She says she rediscovered the library and she was able to pay down some of her credit cards. John Perry, 42, says one of the things that impacted him the most was a different relationship with things. He said, the things that I had, I began to appreciate more. He developed a knack for fixing things, he says, rather than replacing them. They felt so good about their compact that at the end of the year, they renewed it for another year. In today's text, we find King Solomon doing just the opposite here. Instead of withdrawing from spending, he's spending plenty, and we're going to read more about that this morning. Today we turn our attention to King Solomon's palace. Now, if you've not been with us for the past several weeks, we've been working through the life of Solomon. We started all the way back in the last Sunday of May, and we just kind of worked one by one through these different chapters of 1 Kings. In July, we spent a lot of time talking about Solomon's wisdom, and in August, we are spending time talking about the temple. Now, you might say, well, we're talking about his palace today, but it has something to do with the temple. At least it's closely related to the temple. Last week, I'll remind you that we finished chapter 6, and I'll put this verse on the screen this morning. We read this. In the 11th year of the month of Bul, the 8th month, the temple was finished in all its details. According to its specifications, he had spent 7 years building it. Now, you might say, that seems like a long time, 7 years to build something. But you have to remember, they did not have the modern machinery that they have today. So 7 years is really quite a modest amount of time to spend on such a project. But then you flip over to the first verse of chapter 7. Now, you have to remember, the Bible chapters were added later, okay? So that it's not like, somebody finishes chapter 6 and then they're going to start in on chapter 7. The divisions were later. So this is really in the same flow of thought. We read this in 7:1. It took Solomon 13 years, however, to complete the construction of his palace. You see, these two are contrasted here. 7 years for the temple, 13 years for the palace. This morning we're going to talk a little bit about the contrast between these two things. And I believe that the author of 1 Kings is trying to show us something here. He's trying to show us where Solomon's heart is in terms of the temple and in terms of the palace. We see that he gives almost double the amount of attention to his own house than he does God's house. And we're going to see kind of the resources and how they compare this morning. So with your Bibles open to 1 Kings chapter 7, this morning we're going to walk through Solomon's palace, this palace complex. Now, it's worth mentioning this morning that our scripture is the only evidence that we have of Solomon's palace. There are no external documents that detail this palace. Now, interestingly enough, archaeologists have found, however, another palace in northern Syria. They've unearthed this palace, and as they've studied this palace and a temple along with it, they see the specifications matching almost exactly with Solomon's temple. So as they unearth this, they say this is dated somewhat around the same time, may have even been built by some of the same builders that built Solomon's palace, this palace in northern Syria. So it does give us some idea, at least from an archaeological point of view, what Solomon's palace may have looked like. We also have an account from 1 Kings chapter 10 when the Queen of Sheba comes to visit Solomon. I'll put these verses on the screen. We're going to get to this chapter a little bit later, probably later in September. But we read in chapter 10, verse 1, the Queen of Sheba heard about Solomon's fame and his relationship to the Lord, and she came to test Solomon with hard questions. She shows up with a great caravan, verse 2, arriving at Jerusalem with a very great caravan, with camels, carrying spices, large quantities of gold, precious stones. She came to Solomon and talked with him about all that she had on her mind. And look at this description here that we have of her visit with Solomon in verse 3. Solomon answered all of her questions. Nothing was too hard for the king to explain. But not only that, but she was impressed, and the word that's used here is the word overwhelmed with all that she sees. Look at this description in verse 4. When the Queen of Sheba saw the wisdom of Solomon and what? The palace he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his officials, the attending servants in their robes, his cupbearers, the burnt offerings he had made of the temple of the Lord, she was overwhelmed. I find it interesting that the palace is part of what overwhelms her. She's very impressed with this structure that we're going to be talking about this morning. Now, we don't have pictures of Solomon's palace, but we do have very detailed description in God's Word of this palace. So this morning, with your Bibles open to 1 Kings chapter 7, I'm going to ask Dan Lavoie to come and read this morning. He's going to read verses 2 through 12, and let me encourage you to leave that text open as we read it together this morning.
With 4 rows of cedar columns supporting trimmed cedar beams, it was roofed with cedar above the beams that rested on the columns, 45 beams, 15 to a row. Its windows were placed high in sets of 3, facing each other. All the doorways had rectangular frames. They were in the front parts in set of 3, facing each other. He made a colonnade 50 cubits long and 30 wide. In front of it was a portico, and in front of that were pillars and an overhanging roof. He built the throne hall, the hall of justice, where he was to judge, and he covered it with cedar from floor to ceiling. And the palace in which he was to live, set further back, was similar in design. Solomon also made a palace like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, who he had married. All these structures, from the outside to the great courtyard and from foundation to eaves, were made of blocks of high-grade stone cut to size and smoothed on their inner and outer faces. The foundations were laid with large stones of good quality, some measuring 10 cubits and some 8. Above were high-grade stones cut to size and cedar beams. The great courtyard was surrounded by a wall of 3 courses of dressed stone and 1 course of trimmed cedar beams, as was the inner courtyard of the temple of the Lord with its portico.
All right, thanks, Dan. You read this, don't you? And you kind of go, okay, I'm kind of getting the picture of this. It's kind of hard to picture in your minds as you're reading this. But notice the details. Notice the attention to details that the author of 1 Kings gives us about this. Now let's kind of walk through this together, and I hope as we're done this morning, you'll have somewhat of a word tour of this place. There are 5 buildings or 5 sections that are described here. Now the first 3 have names, and the last 2 have no special names attached to them. Now, the palace says, first of all, there's lots of cedar here. Okay, lots of wood. We read that of the temple. Where did the cedar come from? Anybody know? From the forest of Lebanon, right? And this particular building, the first building that's mentioned, has so much wood in it that they just name it. This is the house of the forest of Lebanon. Lots of wood in this place. We read in verse 2 here, he built a palace of the forest of Lebanon, 100 cubits long. Again, a cubit is from your elbow to your fingertip, so it's roughly 1.5 feet if you want to do the math there. 50 wide, 30 high, 4 rows of cedar columns supporting trimmed cedar beams, roofed with cedar above the beams that rested on the columns, 45 beams, 15 to a row. Now, we read in later descriptions of this particular building of the palace, it serves, or it seems to serve, as an armory or as a storehouse for Solomon. In chapter 10, I'll put this verse on the screen, we read that Solomon made 300 small shields of hammered gold, 3 minas of gold in each shield. The king put them where? In the palace of the forest of Lebanon. We also read down in verse 21 of that chapter, all of King Solomon's goblets were gold, and all the household articles in the where? The palace of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. So this particular room, one of 5, seems to be constructed just to store Solomon's stuff, okay? He's got lots of weapons, he's got lots of gold, lots of goblets, lots of stuff, and he builds a portion of his palace, this one room, in order to store all of his stuff. Now let's keep going this morning. The second building is described in verse 6, a colonnade, 50 cubits long, 30 wide. It was a portico, and in the front of that were pillars and an overhanging roof. Now it's worth mentioning here that the measurements of this one building are just about as large as the temple, okay? This one building, one of 5, is as big as the entire temple complex. So we have this arsenal building, and now we have this portico of pillars. Now the third building that is described here, it's mentioned as part of the complex, is what we call the Hall of Justice in verse 7, or you see it called the Throne Hall. And here we say, this is the room where he judged. It was covered with cedar from floor to ceiling. Again, an impressive building. Again, fast forwarding over to 1 Kings chapter 10, we read of the throne itself. This is the throne that is inside the throne room. The king made a great throne covered with ivory and overlaid with fine gold. The throne had 6 steps, and its back had a rounded top. On both sides of the seat were armrests with a lion standing beside each of them. 12 lions stood on the 6 steps, one at either end of the step. Nothing like it had ever been made for any other kingdom. You getting how big this place is? How extravagant it is? Solomon's got, so far we've got 3 buildings. This one building has this tremendous throne. I'll show you a picture. I'll put this one on the screen here. This is a picture that was painted in 1890, and it depicts the Queen of Sheba visiting Solomon in his throne room. Now again, this is not a real picture. This is not painted until 1890, but it does give us some idea of how extravagant that room would have been. And again, this is just one of 5 rooms in the palace. You see, everybody who visits Solomon, they're impressed by his palace. Again, we got to keep in mind, the palace as we are describing it is overshadowing the temple that we talked about last week. Again, more resources in the palace. Again, more time spent constructing the palace. We keep reading here. We see the final 2 buildings. The first is mentioned in verse 8. The palace in which he was to live set farther back, and it was similar in design. And then the second one for his wife, the Pharaoh's daughter, in verse 8, Solomon also made a palace like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had married. Now, the second palace is likely outside of the city. We've read this in other places. Again, it would not have been acceptable for an Egyptian queen to live beside the temple. So Solomon builds another place for her. Now, when we lived in Springfield, our church was directly across the street from the governor's mansion. And every time I'd have someone visit from out of town, I would always go on the tour of the governor's mansion with them. We'd walk across the street. We would go into the living room of the governor's mansion, living rooms, really, lots of them. We would go into a dining room of the governor's mansion. We would even go and peek into the guest bedrooms of the governor's mansion. But the place we were not allowed to go was what? The living quarters. You could not go into the living quarters of the governor. Now, when we lived in Springfield, the governor of Illinois chose not to live in the governor's mansion. He wanted to stay in Chicago. People in Springfield were not too happy with that. Now, that same governor is now in federal prison. I don't think he was able to opt out of that living quarters. But he did live in Chicago and not in the governor's mansion. The same way that many public officials have living quarters, we have Solomon with his living quarters here. Again, he provides a special place for his wife, his Egyptian wife. And notice that this place is its own palace, and very likely, again, is outside of the city. How do we know that? We read in 2 Chronicles chapter 8, and I'll put this verse on the screen. Solomon brought Pharaoh's daughter up from the city of David to the palace he had built for her, for he said, what? My wife must not live in the palace of David, king of Israel, because the places of the ark of the Lord has entered are holy. Now notice, he brings his wife in, but she does not live in the palace with him. It seems that all of Solomon's wives eventually end up living outside of his palace. Why is that? It seems like Solomon knows that there's something wrong with what he's doing here. He's marrying pagan wives, he's building a temple for the Lord, and he knows the temple is holy, he knows God is holy, and he does not bring his wives close to the temple. It seems like Solomon is able to compartmentalize that part of his life. But he knows God's not happy with it. He knows that God's not happy with what he's doing. And again, we do that sometimes, don't we? We have areas of our life that we compartmentalize. You know, we are okay with doing this over here, but then it seems like it doesn't really belong in this other part of our life. And that's what Solomon seems to be doing here. It's worth noting here, Pharaoh's daughter seems to be the only wife who gets her own palace. The other wives live in palaces, but she gets her own. Now, let's keep going here, and we're going to come back and wrap this up. But let's talk about the 5 buildings that are mentioned here. Again, we understand that Solomon's palace is extravagant here, and it is far superior to the temple in terms of resources, in terms of time spent on it. We also know that there's lots of wood from the forests of Lebanon. We talked about how Hiram, this king of Tyre, is the one providing all the wood for Solomon. We keep reading in verse 9, all the structures from the outside to the great courtyard, from the foundation to the eaves, were made of what? Blocks of high-grade stone, cut to size and smooth to their inner and outer faces. We read down in verse 10, the foundations were laid with large stones of what? Of good quality. Now, if Solomon's going to Lowe's to pick out the supplies, he's not buying the cheap stuff, okay? He's buying the most expensive stuff that he can find. They're bringing in these stones. They're building the palace, and it is extravagant, and it is of high quality. Again, in verse 11, above were high-grade stones cut to size, cedar beams, great courtyard surrounded by a wall of 3 courses of dressed stone, 1 course of trimmed cedar beams, as was the inner courtyard of the temple of the Lord with its portico. See, the author of 1 Kings is trying to tell us something here. Solomon is building an extravagant palace. Good quality, high grade, no doubt an impressive structure. Now, you might be going, okay, that's kind of cool, that's kind of interesting, but what in the world does that have to do with me, right, in my life? I had someone tell me last week after church was over, they said, I thought we were going to get a class in architecture, about Solomon's temple, and I really didn't know what that would have to do with my life. And you might be saying this morning, that's interesting from a historical perspective, but Solomon building a palace, what does that have to do with you, and what does that have to do with me? You see, Solomon knew that the temple was something that he should do, right? Solomon had been given tremendous resources by God. He was told by his father David, you are to build a temple. But it seems, as we're reading this, that Solomon is more concerned about his own house than he is God's house. Let's go back to the story of the temple. Do you remember the whole story, how David envisioned the temple being built in 2 Samuel? David saw his house, and then he saw God's tent, and he knew something was wrong. I'll put this verse on the screen, 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 1. After the king, this is talking about David, was settled in his palace, and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around here, he said to Nathan the prophet, here I am, living in a house of cedar, while the ark of God remains in a tent. Do you see David's heart here? Do you see what David is thinking here? He looks at his house, and he says, it's really nice. He looks at God's house, and he says, it's a tent. And he doesn't like that, and he desires to do something about that problem. And interestingly enough, Solomon, his son, builds the temple in all of its extravagance, but then he builds his house bigger than the temple. So he's right back to where he started, right? Right back to where David started. But Solomon doesn't seem to have a problem with it like his father David did. Again, we got to understand, God doesn't need a house. God doesn't need a temple, right? You might even remember when Nathan came back to David in 2 Samuel chapter 7. God said to David, I've not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt to this day. I've been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling. God doesn't need a temple to be God. He's still God. God doesn't need a temple to be bigger than Solomon. But as we read this text this morning, these two structures symbolize for us Solomon's priorities, Solomon's heart. You see, God's okay with a tent, but again, I think the author of 1 Kings wants us to know there's something wrong with what's going on in Solomon's heart here. Solomon has a divided heart. And we know this not only from these two structures, we know it from everything else that's going on in Solomon's life. Solomon, on the one hand, wants to honor God. He builds a temple. But at the same time, Solomon's pretty concerned about his own stuff, isn't he? He's marrying wives left and right who are pagan. Again, you might be saying, well, he's building alliances, right? He's trying to strengthen his kingdom. He's trying to build a place where God's people can live in prosperity. But he's doing it in a way that is contrary to the law of God. We talked a few weeks ago about Solomon's horses, right? He's building all these stables, and the law specifically says the king must not accumulate lots of horses, and Solomon's doing it anyways. You see, Solomon is living a half-hearted sort of life, and this temple and this palace represent for us what's really going on in Solomon's heart. See, Jesus had something to say about this. You might remember in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus is teaching on a number of issues. And Jesus tells his disciples this in Matthew 6, verse 19. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. Jesus tells us, look, you got to be careful where you put your resources. And when we talk about our resources here, when we talk about our treasure, we're not just talking about money. We're talking about time. We're talking about energy. We're talking about all the things that we give ourselves to. And Jesus says, look, you can put your stuff, your time, your energy, your resources into stuff that's not going to last. But then he says in verse 20, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, where thieves do not break in and steal. Jesus says, look, there's a place where you can put your stuff. There's a place where you can invest yourself where things will not be destroyed. And again, Jesus says this place is in heaven, and he's talking about placing it in the care of God, in the things of God. And then Jesus says this in verse 21, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Where we take our time, our attention, our resources, our energy, and where we place those things, that's where our heart gravitates towards. And it seems like Solomon's heart is in his house rather than God's house. His heart is with his wives instead of in the holy things of God. This is what we see here. Again, Solomon's heart is divided. Now, again, Solomon was good giving to God, but he seems to be more concerned with his own stuff. As Jesus warned, Solomon's heart tends to gravitate toward those places. This passage, I think, shows us, and I think the author of 1 Kings is trying to say to us, Solomon is half in here. He's not all in. Now, picture with me these two structures. A temple, a grand building, plenty of ways the temple did honor God. But as we compare it to Solomon's palace, we begin to get a glimpse of this palace overshadowing the temple. Let me ask you this morning, where is your heart? Are you offering your best to God? Now, I want to be clear this morning. I'm not saying that we should give equal time to the church as we do to our families. That would be impossible. It would not be feasible for us to do that, right? But I want to be clear this morning that when we talk about the temple, we're not just talking about this local church. We're talking about the mission of God in this world, okay? And so the things that we do in our lives, at work, at home, in our neighborhoods, can be the temple stuff, you see, can be God stuff, can be mission-oriented stuff. Now, certainly the church is a part of God's mission in the world, but I'm not saying, give half or more stuff to the church than you give to your family. Give more attention to the church than you do to your family. I'm saying give more attention, though, to God and the things of God than you do your family. See, I'm spending a lot of time these days on a football field. I'm coaching a Metro football team, Levi's team, 4th and 5th graders. And I'm giving time and attention there. And you might say, well, that's my stuff, right? Well, it's not my stuff. It's God's stuff, isn't it? Because these little kids on a football field, that's a way to do God's mission in the world, you see. Praying for those kids, thinking about those kids, offering constructive criticism to how they tackle, right? In a way that's loving can show Jesus to them. And you can think of doing that in your workplace. The things that you do in your world don't have to be your stuff. We tend to draw a line, don't we? My stuff, God's stuff. I'll give God Sunday morning and a certain amount of my resources, and then the rest of it's mine. No, that's not at all what we're saying here. We're saying your life is to be on mission for God. And I want you to picture these two images in your mind this morning, a temple and a palace, okay? Which one's bigger for you? Which one gets more of your attention? Which one, if they were to be buildings of stone and wood, would be bigger than the other? Again, images. Again, we're not talking about your house and this building, okay? Don't go there. We're talking about your life on mission with God and your life with your own interest and your own selfish ambitions. Compare the two. Which one's bigger? Which one's greater? Where's your heart? Where's your time? Where's your energy? Again, please don't misunderstand me this morning, because I want God's mission to be more than just what happens in this building. I'm not telling you to give more resources to this local church. I'm telling you, though, to be on mission for God. When you wake up in the morning and you go to work, be on mission for God. When you go into your neighborhoods and you talk to your neighbors, you spend time with your family, be on mission with God. And you're building a temple. You're building the things of God. Now, certainly, we have to care for ourselves. Certainly, there are our own interests. But may our temples dwarf our palaces. May our temples in our lives, our hearts, and the things that we're building in this world for God overshadow the tiny houses in our lives. Again, I'm speaking symbolically here. We're going to take a few minutes this morning as we close together and as we think about the temple and the palace. I want to ask you the question: where's your energy? Where's your time? Where's your resources? Where is your focus? Is it on the things of God, or is it on your own stuff? This morning, if you'd like to come and pray with me, I'll be standing down front. If you'd like to come and join this church and be a part of this community of faith, now would be the time for you to walk down and let me know that. Maybe you'd like to be baptized. Now would be the time that you could come down and say, I'd like to be baptized. Maybe this morning, this altar would be a place that you'd want to come and pray. Maybe there's some other way in which God's working in your heart. You just need to kneel this morning, and you need to pray. You come and do that in the privacy of this place. Let's all stand together as a family, and let's respond to God's calling in our lives.